All right, so thank you so much for joining us, Ama. I'm really excited to have you and to talk a little bit more about how you've gotten to where you are. So maybe to start us off, you can tell us a little bit more about yourself and how we met.
Sorry, you broke up a little bit. Tell me a little bit about yourself and
Aha!
I'm just playing with you. So, how we met, huh?
Yeah, how did
Well,
we meet?
were you in the room when I was delivered?
I don't think so. You know, we've never asked mom, but that'd be an interesting question to ask her. So for those of you who are watching, this is actually my sister. So Nyame-Mensah is actually my little sister. And I'm super excited to have a chance to speak with her because I feel like she's done some really amazing things. And I think that a lot of people can learn from her experience going from, being a college student to now being a lecturer at a university and really trying to decide what to do next. So yeah, Ama, can you maybe just tell us a little bit more about sort of where you are now and sort of what got you excited about being in an academic setting? What was it about being in that academic setting, and is that something you're looking to do into the future?
Sure. So, in terms of a background, I have a sort of interesting background. So, I actually began my sort of love affair with what I currently have my business in, which is data consulting, when I was a kid. And in fact, I double checked this with our mother. And apparently, when I was very, very young, I used to help dad with inputting data into Excel on one of the old computers, which I'm guessing was probably a Mac. And at the time, I didn't know that, this is probably some child labor issues going on, but I used to like sit and like help him input the data. And fast forward probably, 10, 15 years in college, I found myself doing a degree in economics, but I was doing a BA, not a BS. And part of that was because I was really interested in the human and sort of behavioral aspect of economics. And so I was really driven by this passion to sort of understand people. And that naturally led me into wanting to do more applied research, really with practical application. So understanding like, how can we use data? How can we use research to really help propel social change? And so that, of course, led me to want to go do even more education. And so I found myself doing a master's degree in urban affairs and public policy. And so that's really where I began to sort of learn a little bit more, not just about data, but really where data is situated. So oftentimes when we think about data, we think about it just as it being this, thing that sort of just sits on its own that doesn't really do much. But I began to think about how we could use data and other forms of methodology. So research methodologies, for example, or the ways in which that we can use data to further an argument, to interpret the social world around us. And so from there, I found myself providing technical assistance and sort of like research methodology assistance to colleagues and other folks. And so after finishing my master's degree, I worked for several years in Washington, D.C. at a research center where most of my primary duties, I should say, not data, were around data. And I found myself really wanting to engage a little bit deeper in the sort of insidious ways in which data are used. So as I said, we often think about like data as being raw and pure and, not value laden, but with some of the work that I was doing, I began to sort of question some of those foundations, and that led me to want to do even more education. So I ended up enrolling in a PhD program in social welfare at the University of Pennsylvania, and that's really where I was able to hone in on my passion for doing applied social research with practical applications and learning how theory and methodology and data all sort of work together to form, the basis of a project, to better articulate, an idea. And so now that I'm finished with my PhD, I'm a lecturer and postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania at the School of Social Policy and Practice, as well as launching this budding business with helping folks really just make sense of their data And so, as you know, right now, there's just so much data out there. And so I feel really privileged to be in a space where I've worked, sort of along the continuum of data, if you will, from collecting data all the way to processing, analyzing, and even visualizing the data. And so with my business, I focus primarily on the latter sort of rungs of that data process, where I'm helping folks with analyzing the data and visualizing it in order, to persuade folks to better understand what's going on within their own organizations, or even just for those who are curious about, how to make sense of data, right? Because oftentimes that's not necessarily a skill that's taught. We're sort of taught the sort of rote techniques of, doing statistical analysis or quantitative or qualitative analysis, but sometimes folks just struggle with trying to interpret it and sort of place the data in context. And fortunately, with both my training, education, and experience, that's something I do quite well.
Well, thank you for taking us through that. I think for me, one of the most impressive things I've seen is sort of how you went from, working full time to then working within the more academic space. Can you talk a little bit about sort of that transition and how you even selected the university that you're now lecturing at and you had a chance to go to school?
So I think like most young folks who have some education, so either at your bachelor's level or the master's level, I really sort of waffled about whether or not I wanted to get more training and or, work for a little bit. And it just so happened that I was at a point after finishing my master's degree that I really wanted to get a better sense as to how the skills I had learned throughout the program could be applied. And so I, for that reason, decided I wanted to work for several years, really to just get that experience and really think a little bit more about what direction I wanted to go in. Both my undergrad and master's degrees were applied based, but they didn't necessarily focus very much on theory and the ways in which we can create theoretical frameworks to, drive research projects or better understand what the research projects are really accomplishing. And so I didn't really find that out until after I'd worked. And so working really helped me to hone in on this aspect of wanting to help people with making sense of their data, and sort of imbued within that is this nature of wanting to sort of teach, right? And so oftentimes we think of people who have PhDs as teachers. And so in some ways, really sort of the foundation of my business is teaching people to make sense of their data, right? So teaching tips, tricks, and really even sometimes just getting into the nitty-gritty with helping them understand these often sort of fuzzy concepts around what it is they're doing and to help them accomplish their data goals.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think that you also bring up something that's really interesting. And I'm sure you get this question a lot. I know we've talked a bit about it, but I think one thing people might be interested in hearing is, why is it that you decided to, still work kind of within an academic space, but not become a full professor? Why is it that you kind of always want to have, you kind of have like one foot in and one foot out? And I think another thing that your trajectory sort of in your education has always been about applied. So yeah, can you talk a little bit more about your decision to be in academia, but not completely?
Yeah, so probably going into my degree, I had a sense that I didn't necessarily want to be what's sort of typically called as the tenure track professor. And so those are the folks who are going into academia for the sole purpose of becoming eventually a full professor if they reach that sort of rung of the ladder. And part of that reason initially I thought is because I didn't like to teach, which is kind of silly now thinking back on the type of work that I currently do. But as I got through my program, I realized that the type of work that I wanted to do didn't necessarily fit into the mold of the traditional sort of academic. And that's not to say that there aren't many, academics that do practical work or do, applied research with practical applications. In fact, I work with several. But for me, where I want to go with my work doesn't necessarily lead to wanting to be a sort of tenure track professor. Other types of professorships I am interested in, for example, are what we call sort of research professorships or practice-based professorships. And these tend to be individuals who are, as the title suggests, those who are doing research primarily versus teaching, and those who are more practice oriented are those who typically either have been in the field for many years and are coming to do a professorship position in academia. and or are currently still in that role, let's say in city government, for example, and also hold this position within a university. But where I am right now, about a year or so out after graduating, I really enjoy this sort of hybrid space of still being able to engage with folks in the academy, but still also having the space to do the type of work that it's meaningful to me and that sort of fulfills me.
Yeah, I know one of the things that you have the opportunity to do is sort of mentor a lot of people within that space of being interested in leveraging data and using data. What sort of advice do you have for people that might be looking beyond a regular full professorship?
So I think that's a really great question. There's often this sort of stigma around if you have a PhD or, if you're in a graduate program at the master's level, you sort of have to go and do a PhD and be sort of launched into this trajectory of being a professor. And there's so many other opportunities out there for folks who have these skills of really loving and engaging with data and research, but also being very mindful of the theory and methodologies behind them. And in fact, I think for me, part of the reason why it's been quite easy in terms of the transition from PhD student to now, postdoctoral fellow, lecturer, and also having this business is that I had a great role model with our father, right? So he has a PhD, he had taught for several years at Morgan, and then he decided to go into this sort of quasi NGO space. And so that's a really great example of having a PhD, but then working outside of academia. And oftentimes, folks think that those skills aren't valued outside of academia, and that's not necessarily the case. In fact, right now, there's really a push to hire a lot of folks who are PhD level researchers who can speak to not just the implementation of a project, but also conceptualizing, coming up with the idea, being able to mentor and educate folks about the entire sort of research process, which is something that you don't always necessarily get at the undergraduate or master's level. And so there are many, many different opportunities in industry, private sector, NGOs, even many governmental units are now hiring folks who have PhDs that are research-based as well as data-focused. And like myself, there are also many people who are finding that they simply just want to create their own space and launch their own business to deal with a specific niche in the market that they find most interesting.
Great. So let's talk a little bit more about data, because this is one of the reasons why I wanted to have a conversation with you. I love when you're talking to me about how data can be used, how it can be transformed, and also manipulated. What are some of the things that people need to be looking out for in terms of data? Even like maybe you can start telling us surprisingly where data is used and sort of may be manipulated in ways or used even against us.
Sure. So yeah, that's a really interesting question given the current moment, right? So I think right now what's sort of on everyone's mind worldwide is sort of the use of data to, either better understand the current global pandemic and the health crisis and or to sort of, in a sense, cover it up, right? And so for me, I think the best example of how we can use data to sort of cover up and or, mislead the public is, I want to say maybe a month or two ago, and it's probably ongoing, there was this really interesting graphic that came out, and they were showing the sort of 7, I think, to 10 day average of spikes in the number of people who were being diagnosed with COVID. And what sort of stuck out to me, and I thought it was so fascinating, so since I deal with data all the time, it sort of jumped out at me right away. Mm-hmm. And what I ended up finding is along the sort of x-axis, which we typically would see for something where we're trying to sort of display time, right? And along the y-axis, we would have, either the number of cases or the number of cases per some amount. They were out of order. And so they weren't actually showing the number of people who were being diagnosed with the disease over time. They sort of jumbled it up in such a way that it was misleading to, the audience and the person looking at it. And so it seemed as though that the cases were decreasing. And no, the cases probably weren't decreasing. And so that's a really sort of, I don't want to use the word great way, but that's one way, in fact, that it's really easy to sort of lie with data when we're using these pictorials or graphics. But, when we're mindful of, what it is that we're trying to sort of portray, when we have a good understanding of the data, right? Data can really be a powerful way to sort of uncover inequities and inequalities, right? And so a really great example is also the public health crisis. This really, brought a lot of attention to the fact that there are certain populations who are, not just more likely to get this disease, because I think when we say that, it somehow, muddies up the fact that these populations are already marginalized anyway. And so we're actually finding something that many of us have already known, for example, where Black and Latinx populations are increasingly, becoming, or correctly, I should say, coming down with this disease simply due to the, structural inequities that currently exist in many different countries, not just in the US, right? And so I think, those two examples really show the polar opposites of how we can use data in a positive way and how we can use data to sort of mislead people. And I think part of, why I wanted to work with data is because I found that through my work with data, data aren't pure, data aren't raw. It's up to the person who's sort of working with the data to interpret it, to turn it into something that's usable, to turn it into something, that you can act on. And I really do love that aspect of it, because it's something that after every project you sort of sit back and think about, well, what could I have done differently? How might someone have interpreted this differently? And I find that to be a sort of rewarding process, even if I don't, at the end of the project do it in the way that I probably maybe should have, thinking back on it, but then I can apply it in my next project or on the next, work I do.
Great. Yeah. And I think that's a really good segue to talk maybe a little bit more about the type of research that you've done in the past, and a little bit more about your thesis. Where do you tend to focus, and why was that, an area of focus you were interested in?
That's a really interesting question. So as I said, my background is really sort of muddied. I've sort of dabbled in many different types of research areas, and increasingly, probably the last 5 to 7 years, I've focused almost primarily on education and child development and child welfare. And part of the reason why I've focused on these sort of 3 intersecting topics is because a lot of the work that I had previously been doing, which was around community development and economic development, was all pointing to this fact that, if we can somehow get to the root of the causes of many of these structural inequities, and oftentimes much of the work I was doing was around like workforce development, higher education outcomes, we would be able to, have people who could really contribute to society in a much better and stronger way. And in fact, part of the reason why I ended up in the PhD program in social welfare at the School of Social Policy and Practice at Penn is because I was working on this project where the data we were looking at was around inequities in STEM and higher education, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And I was sitting at this, I believe, conference or roundtable of sorts, and folks were talking about the fact that, women weren't interested in STEM careers. And given the amount of data that are currently out there around, differences between, who goes into STEM, who comes out with a STEM degree, who's more likely to, get promoted in a STEM field, one might come to that conclusion. But then when I took a step back and thought about it, I also asked myself another question. I said, is it really the case that, let's say girls or, non-males aren't interested? Or is that what society is telling them, and that's why they end up not choosing those careers? And unfortunately, that's not a question that you can necessarily answer simply, within the sort of space of higher education. You need to go back to their childhoods to really understand what's going on. And so that's really what led to me of this focus around child development, child welfare, and education in that space, specifically because schools and school settings are the primary institution where children reside, and that's where a lot of their interactions are, and that's where a lot of their identity is formed and shaped outside of the family and home, of course. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah. And I mean, sort of tell us a little bit more about some of the projects that you're on now. So in addition to being an entrepreneur and having your own practice, what sort of things are you working on?
Yeah. So trying to think. So one I technically can't talk about. However, the sort of scope of the project is such that we're partnering with a government unit to better help them understand their data, to improve their data use and their capacity to use data both internally and externally. which is super vague, sorry.
No, that's fair. And I think that's a good sort of way to like answer the question, how can people start to build this culture of leveraging data, of collecting data? Do you have any thoughts, especially for maybe smaller companies that don't have as much capacity, or organizations who are just looking to start leveraging data in a different way?
So, you know, it's really funny because I actually got an email from someone not too long ago that was along those lines. And funny enough, most of my experiences have been at smaller organizations. And I use the term small loosely, but thinking back to my time working full-time in DC, our staff was only about 3 to 4 people. Granted, we were embedded within a larger organization that had much larger networks, but I think that there's this misconception that you have to have like this huge team of folks, you know, who run the sort of gamut in terms of their abilities in order to build a data culture. And that's not necessarily the case. Oftentimes, most organizations, especially smaller ones, and in particular like nonprofits, NGOs, they're already collecting the data that they need, at least as a starting off point. And the real issue tends to lie in the sort of quality of the data and how they're going to use it.
Mm-hmm.
And so oftentimes I find when I'm speaking with folks, it's not so much the case that they don't know the type of data they need to collect. They might, you know, need some brainstorming around whether or not they're collecting the right metrics, but oftentimes they have a pretty good sense as to what it is that they need and want. It's, you know, partnering with someone to help, you know, further those conversations around how they want to use it. And usually those conversations sort of stem from this need of, you know, board members really trying to understand, for example, the organization's impact, and or, for example, oftentimes at smaller organizations, staff want to know if they're using their time in the best way possible, given, you know, their duties, right? And so that is all, you know, things that you can do internally with, you know, maybe 1 or 2 people spending, you know, half of their time sort of making sure that you're putting in place structures to input the data in a way so that it's clear, it's of high quality. And then perhaps as your organization grows, then you can maybe hire someone full-time or part-time to then take on that role to sort of continue on in that process. But I think for me, when it comes to, you know, building that data culture, it's really all about wanting to learn.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes some people feel that, you know, they're a little bit rigid and stringent about what it is they want to collect, maybe because they don't want to, you know, be looked at in a negative light, or maybe they've been burned in the past when they worked with another consultant and they maybe didn't do what they want. And so it's really about, you know, that willingness to learn and finding someone who's willing to really collaborate with you to help you along in that process, to really teach you what it is that you need to know in order to then in the future be self-sustaining. Because oftentimes when you work with consultants, even if it's on a one-off basis or on a long-term basis, they sort of hold back and don't really teach you what it is you need to know. And that's not really my philosophy. I think that if you're working with organizations to sort of build this data culture and this data capacity, they need to then take sort of control of the process eventually and also take ownership. And so by giving them, you know, that collaborative aspect of working with them, that helps them to take ownership, and it also allows them to learn the process, and then they can see the sort of value in it, and then they can go on to do it for themselves and, you know, make sure that culture then becomes ingrained into the sort of mission of the organization itself. Because oftentimes folks think of data as being separate from the organization. It's this thing that we need to collect, you know, for that grant, or it's that thing we need to do for the board because they want to see what our impact is. But it really is, you know, to help propel the organization forward, because it helps you keep account of what it is that you're doing, what it is that you would like to do, yeah, just where you're going. So
great, yeah. So okay, so we build this culture of collecting data, and I know your favorite part actually is talking to people about what you do with it, right? That visualization part. So what are some things that people should keep in mind when they are putting together graphics or thinking about visualizing it, so people can understand the impact, or they're trying to tell a story?
So I think when it comes to visualizing data, the really important piece there is finding a story that you want to share. Oftentimes when I've worked with folks in the past, there's been this sort of, you know, rush to like tell all the stories in maybe one pictorial or one graph. And that really shouldn't be, you know, the use of that particular graph. Now, if you're putting together something that's more of a compilation, if it's like an infographic, that's a little bit different, right? But when we're just sort of thinking of like the bare bones graphic and you maybe have one data set, you really just want to be able to tell one story, and you want to tell it in a really compelling way. And that really rests on being able to find that story in the data. And so whenever I'm working with people, I'll say, you know, you maybe want to sort of think and brainstorm about what are the stories you can tell with this data set, right? What's interesting, what sort of stands out, what's something that you expected, what's something you didn't expect, and have that be the focal point and have that be the sort of story that you can then build this visualization around.
Great. All right. Well, I mean, I think that's pretty much what I think I wanted to cover with you. I just thought it was just a really great opportunity to sort of share your story, share how you got into what you do, because I think it's incredibly unique. Is there anything else you want to share about how you've gotten to where you are, or in terms of what you do?
Um, Actually, I hadn't thought about that. I mean, there's so much. I think that, you know, folks who are in the sort of data / research space, there's a lot of opportunity to, you know, be a sort of jack of all trades, or,
Yeah.
but there's also a lot of opportunity to really specialize. And I think from, you know, when I entered my PhD program to where I am now, I've really come to enjoy working with particular types of data sets, particular types of research topics, right, particular types of organizations. And I really do hope that folks who enter this space don't feel shy about specializing and don't feel like they need to apply their skills or the tools that they've learned to just everything, because oftentimes I find that when that happens, then you're maybe a little bit less passionate about it, and maybe you have a little bit less that you can share about how you can help that organization or that individual who comes to you.
Right, yeah. And I mean, this is a good way maybe for us to end with, who are the types of people you would like to be partnering with or working with? And yeah, what are the services you provide?
Sure. So I specialize primarily in data analysis and data visualization. So as I said, the sort of tagline I have is I help people make sense of their data. So I like working with folks who already have data and, you know, maybe it's not in the best format. Maybe they're, you know, having trouble sort of finding the story in the data. And then of course, wanting to report that data out, visualize it, have you. And so in terms of the services that I provide, I primarily like to do the data analysis piece. So anything from statistical analysis to descriptive work, as well as with more of the data visualization in terms of designing the data, creating infographics, creating graphs that really help people not just make sense of their data, but really understand what's going on. And so the types of folks that I like to sort of partner with would be, you know, smaller organizations to mid-sized organizations, as well as individuals who work sort of in this nexus of, you know, child welfare, child development, as well as broadly education, given my experience and background working really from sort of the gamut in terms of, you know, K all the way through higher ed. So yeah.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I mean, always, anytime I have a conversation with you, I'm always so blown away. And yeah, thanks. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, I hope you have an amazing evening.
I hope you have an amazing evening too.